At the age of 52, I had come to terms with my place in life. I had recently retired from my teaching career and was living in a serene house on the outskirts of town, spending my days immersed in gardening and books. My husband had passed away 5 years earlier, and since then, I had found solace in a simple daily routine. However, I was unprepared for the changes that came with my stepson Ethan moving in. Ethan, 22 and freshly graduated, was eager to launch his career as a graphic designer in the city. His father and I had been married just 2 years before his passing, and although Ethan and I didn't have many opportunities to connect back then, we had always been polite to each other. When he called me a few months ago, I hadn't heard from him in a while. "Hey Claire," he said, his voice tinged with hesitation. "I know this is a bit sudden, but I need to ask you for a favor." I could sense the worry in his tone, and even before he finished speaking, I realized what he was going to request. He was between jobs, struggling to find his footing in a competitive industry, and had difficulties with his rent. I told him he was welcome to stay with me for as long as necessary, until he secured stable employment and a place of his own. I vividly recall the day he arrived. I had spent the morning tidying up the guest room, making sure everything was perfect. As the hours went by, a wave of anxiety washed over me, something I hadn't felt in years. What would it be like to have someone so young living under my roof again? It had been ages since I had shared my space with anyone, especially a man his age. When he finally pulled up in his old beaten car, I stepped outside to greet him. He greeted me with that familiar grin I remembered from family gatherings, but there was a noticeable change. He wasn't the awkward teenager I once knew. Ethan had transformed into a tall, broad-shouldered young man exuding confidence. "Hey Claire," he said, giving me a quick hug. "Thanks for having me." I replied, feeling slightly out of place. "I hope the drive wasn't too rough." "Nah, it was fine. I appreciate you letting me stay here." The first few days passed quietly. Ethan spent most of his time in his room or out job hunting. I tried my best to give him space, not wanting to come across as an overbearing stepmother. Yet the house felt different with him around. I noticed little things like how he would smile at me from across the table or linger in the kitchen, chatting with me about his day. Having someone around was undeniably nice. Then one night a few weeks after he moved in, something unexpected happened. I had gone to bed early, the house enveloped in its usual quietude. Around midnight, I heard the soft creak of my bedroom door opening. Groggy, I turned over and saw Ethan standing in the doorway. "Ethan?" I mumbled, bewildered. "Is everything okay?" He stepped inside, his figure illuminated by the dim hallway light. It was hard to read his expression in the shadows, but I could sense he was troubled. I couldn't sleep," he replied softly, approaching my bed. I sat up, rubbing my eyes. "Is something wrong?" He hesitated before sitting down on the edge of the bed, causing the mattress to dip slightly under his weight. "I don't know," he finally admitted. "I guess I've just been feeling a bit lost." Hearing the vulnerability in his voice tugged at my heart. I had always viewed Ethan as a capable young man, but in that moment, he seemed so fragile. I reached out and placed my hand on his arm, offering the little comfort I could. "You're going to be fine," I assured him gently. "It's just a rough patch. We all go through it at some point." He looked at me, his eyes searching mine, and for a brief moment, the atmosphere between us felt different, thicker. I can't quite explain it. I should have pulled away, should have said something to lighten the mood. Instead, I remained still, my hand resting on his arm. "Thanks, Claire," he murmured, his voice barely audible. I nodded, unsure of how to respond. He stood up slowly, his gaze lingering on me for just a heartbeat longer before he turned and walked back to his room. As the door clicked shut behind him, I lay back down, my heart racing. I was unsure how to interpret the moment we had just shared. Was it merely my imagination, or had something genuinely shifted between us? The next morning, everything felt back to normal. Ethan acted as if nothing had transpired, chatting with me over breakfast about his job search and weekend plans. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself I was overthinking things and that I was simply lonely, misinterpreting the situation. But as the days passed, it became harder to ignore the underlying tension. I noticed it in the way his hand brushed against mine in the hallway, and how he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. It was subtle yet undeniable, leaving me to wonder where this might lead. We sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of what had just occurred settling in. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the TV, while my thoughts raced. I had crossed a line I never thought I would even approach, and there was no turning back. Ethan was still holding me, his hand resting gently on my waist, and I found myself leaning into him, feeling an odd mix of comfort and guilt. "What now?" I finally whispered, more to myself than to him. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned slightly to face me fully, his eyes reflecting a seriousness that sent my heart racing. "We'll take it one step at a time," he said softly. "I don't want to rush anything. I just care about you, Claire, maybe more than I should." The sincerity of his words struck me deeply. It felt surreal to hear such a confession from someone so much younger, someone who belonged to my past rather than my future. Yet, there it was, an undeniable connection between us that we were both grappling to understand. "I care about you too," I admitted, my voice trembling slightly. "But this is complicated, Ethan. Much more complicated than we might think." "I understand," he replied gently. "But we don't have to figure everything out right now. We can just take it slow." I nodded, attempting to process everything. My rational mind was shouting at me to stop, to create some distance and set boundaries. But another part of me, the one that had been buried beneath years of loneliness and grief, was urging me to consider a different path. It was whispering that perhaps I deserved to feel something again, even if it defied convention and came with a mess of complications. In the following days, everything felt different. We didn't speak about the kiss, but the energy between us had transformed. There was a quiet understanding, an unspoken agreement that something had shifted, and we were both carefully navigating it, hesitant to disturb the fragile balance we had created. One evening, about a week later, Ethan returned home from a job interview, a wide grin lighting up his face. "I think it went really well," he announced, casually tossing his bag aside. "They seemed interested, and I'll know by the end of the week." "That's fantastic," I replied, genuinely excited for him. We spent the evening in the living room, chatting and laughing, effortlessly falling into a rhythm that felt surprisingly comfortable. As the night went on, I found myself studying him more intently, taking note of the little things. His laughter, the way he absent-mindedly ran his fingers through his hair, and the warmth in his eyes whenever they met mine. It was a strange sensation, feeling so drawn to him, yet it felt entirely right. Later, as I was making my way upstairs to bed, Ethan called out to me, "Claire." I paused on the stairs, turning to see him standing at the bottom, hands in his pockets, a hint of uncertainty on his face. "What's up?" I asked, my heart racing. "I just wanted to thank you for everything," he said softly. "You've supported me in ways I didn't see coming, and I really don't want to mess anything up between us." I offered him a gentle smile, even though a knot was tightening in my chest. "You're not messing anything up, Ethan. We're both just trying to figure this out." He nodded, his gaze searching mine. "Good night, Claire." "Good night, Ethan." As I lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling, I couldn't help but reflect on how drastically things had changed in such a short period. With him in the house, everything felt more vibrant, more complicated, yet also more fulfilling. Weeks went by, and we continued to dance around this delicate balance. There were moments when the tension would heighten, like when our hands brushed together, or when we sat a little too closely on the couch. Yet, we never confronted it directly. We both sensed that something had altered, but neither of us felt ready to leap forward. One night, after Ethan officially secured his job, we decided to celebrate. We ordered takeout, popped open a bottle of wine, and spent the evening discussing his aspirations, plans, and excitement for the future. As the night wore on and the wine loosened our tongues, our conversation naturally drifted toward us, specifically that night in the kitchen and the kiss. "I can't stop thinking about it," Ethan confessed, his voice low and steady, his eyes locked on mine. "About you." I swallowed hard, feeling that familiar knot tighten. "I can't stop thinking about it either," I whispered. He reached out, taking my hand in his thumb brushing gently against my skin. "I know this is complicated," he said softly, "but I don't care. I just want to be with you." My heart raced, my mind screaming at me to pause, to consider the potential fallout. But at that moment, all I could focus on was him. How he made me feel alive again and the connection we shared that seemed to transcend logic. I want that too, I finally admitted, my voice barely a whisper. With that, the last of my resistance crumbled. We leaned into each other, our lips meeting in a kiss that held all the longing and desire we had suppressed for so long. This time there was no hesitation, no pulling away. That night everything changed between us. We crossed a line that we both knew couldn't be uncrossed, but neither of us wanted to. It was chaotic, complicated, and completely unexpected, yet it felt profoundly real. In that moment, that was all that mattered. As we lay together, the burdens of the world lifted momentarily. I realized that life doesn't always adhere to the rules. Sometimes it throws you into situations you never anticipated with people you never expected, and occasionally you just have to let yourself feel, no matter how complicated it might be or how different it is from what you envisioned. Because in the end, life is fleeting. And perhaps, just perhaps, happiness doesn't always arrive in the forms we expect.